Okay, so let's take a look at the first of our non-fatal offences against the person, and that's assault. And I spent days scouring the internet trying to find one of my beloved Arsenal players, giving the referee a hard time. Couldn't do it, so I had to settle for, obviously, Chelsea. Loads of those pictures. Don't know what that says about Chelsea, but I'll let you be the judge of that. But essentially, assault is this notion that one person expects another person to use violence against them. Not that they actually do, that would be battery. Assault is about the expectation of personal violence. And what we're going to do in this video is we're going to take a look at all of the things that we need to do to prove that a defendant is liable for the offence of assault. And I'll start by looking at this diagram that I've used on previous videos. It demonstrates quite clearly that assault is the least serious of all of the non-fatal offences. It is defined by non-touching. Battery, on the other hand, the next serious one in the group of 5 that we look at, is associated with some form of touching. These two offences together are known as common assault. And they're known as common assault because they are defined in the common law. The other 3, ABH, GBH and GBH with intent, are statutory offences. And they are found in the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. Assault and battery are defined in the common law. Now, in 1988, the government created the Criminal Justice Act, and Section 39 of the Criminal Justice Act recognises the existence of assault and battery, and it also recognises that they are separate offences. So you don't charge with common assault, you charge with either assault or battery. What it also does, though, is say very clearly that they are summary offences. It says that they are tried in the magistrate's court, which of course they would be because they're summary offences, and then it gives the maximum sentence of £5,000 or 6 months imprisonment. What it does not do, what the Criminal Justice Act does not do, is it doesn't define what assault and battery are. It leaves the common law definition. And the common law definition was clearly stated in the appeal to the House of Lords from Fagan versus the Met Police Commissioner. If you remember in Fagan, it's the case where the Irishman parked his car on the police officer's foot, and we use it to look at contemporaneity or coincidence. The Lords in Fagan made it very clear that their preferred definition for assault was an act by which a person intentionally or recklessly causes another person to apprehend immediate and unlawful personal violence. Some 30 years later, that is restated very clearly as the definition for assault in Ireland and Burstow, and we'll take a look at Ireland and Burstow later. But essentially what it does is the definition, and I implore you to commit it to memory, the definition gives us what essentially is the mens rea element. It uses the word cause, so we know that's an actus reus term, but it says that the defendant has to cause the victim to apprehend immediate and unlawful personal violence. Those 3 things go together to give us the actus reus. You will know from our definition, from our liability equation, that in order to show criminal liability, so in order to show that the defendant was criminally liable, we have to demonstrate that all elements of the actus reus have been committed, then that the defendant did that with the necessary mens rea, that there was no defence, and I'm not going to look at defence now, but we do have to show that there's no defence. And if we can show those 3 things, we are able to show that the defendant is criminally liable. So when it comes to answering questions, we would need to show very clearly all elements of the actus reus. We would need to demonstrate apprehension, immediacy and unlawful personal violence. then we would need to demonstrate the intentional or reckless nature of the defendant's mind. Then we would be able to say that the defendant was criminally liable for assault. So let's look at each one in turn, and we'll define and look at each one slightly further. Our first element of actus reus is this notion that it causes the victim to apprehend violence. Now, the apprehension, the causing the victim to apprehend violence, must be an act, not an omission. Although I want to introduce a little problem here. If you recall from our work on omissions, you should remember the case of Santana Bermudez. The defendant was asked by a police officer whether or not there was any needles or sharps in their pocket before a search. They said there wasn't, when quite clearly there was. The police officer put her hand into Santana Bermudez's pocket and pricked herself on a hypodermic syringe. The court said that, similar to Miller, Santana Bermudez has created a dangerous situation and therefore had a duty to act, a duty to tell the police officer. Failing to do that, the omission of failing to tell, led to criminal liability. So that's something that you are going to need to argue as to whether or not Santana Bermudez changes that somewhat to allow an omission to exist. Now, acts are relatively straightforward, but the way in which the law has developed in this area has demonstrated that an act does not have to be a physical act from the defendant. The first thing to look at is that words alone will be sufficient to cause the victim to apprehend violence. The case we use for this is Constanza, and Constanza is it's a stalker case really. And what happens in Constanza is the defendant wants to form a relationship with the victim, and she doesn't want to. Quite obvious when you see what he does afterwards, why she wouldn't want to. But he follows her, sends her more than 800 letters. He telephones her on numerous occasions, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. And he watches her house from his car. He watches her house from his car. He even writes on her front door. Bit weird. The victim suffers from a clinical state of depression and anxiety. The legal principle here is that it's not essential that the victim was able to see the potential perpetrator, so there's no need to see the potential perpetrator, providing that the conduct accompanying the words is capable of making the words an assault. The apprehension was of violence sufficiently immediate to be described as the apprehension of immediate violence. The letters, the telephone calls, were enough for the victim to apprehend immediate unlawful personal violence from Constanza, and he is found guilty. So an act could just be words. Also that same year, the courts went even further, and the court said that even silence can be an assault. And they looked at the two cases of Ireland and Burstow. These are they're not co-defendants, these are two separate cases. But they are very similar in their nature, so they're heard by the Lords at the same time. And in Ireland and Burstow, the defendants made a large number of telephone calls, all to women, and all remain in silence when the women answered. A psychiatrist stated at court that as a result of the repeated telephone calls, each of them had suffered psychological damage, each of the victims. The question was whether the silence amounted to an act that caused, or could amount to an act that caused the victim to apprehend immediate violence. And the key phrase that comes out of Ireland and Burstow is a thing said is a thing done. In short, there are two key things here. One, silence is enough to constitute an assault. And second, psychological, I'm not going to spell this wrong, psychological harm is also is also an outcome that can be included in assault or battery. Okay, so words can be an act sufficient for assault. Even silence can be an assault. What we also need to consider is that there's no assault if it's clear that the accused is not intending to cause harm. So in this point, words can negate liability. So the use of the words can stop there being liability. And in Tuberville versus Savage in 1669, old case of course, the defendant strikes the victim, causing the victim to lose an eye. The facts of the case are that the defendant, this happens at what's known as the assizes time. The assizes is when the court's in town. The defendant places his hand on his sword and says to the victim that if it were not for assizes time, he would tell him more of his mind. So what he is doing is saying, if the judges weren't in town, I would sort you out. The victim defends himself, seeing this as a threat. But there's been no assault because the defendant negated the assault by saying, if the judges weren't here, I'd give you a beating. The defendant's response was to remove the victim's eye in the fight. As the judges were in town, the defendant could not have used force on the victim, and therefore the defendant did not commit assault. I know that sounds quite complicated, but the idea, the basic element that you need to take away from it is because the words that the defendant used were that I will not hurt you because the assizes are in town, he has not committed assault. Even though he said, and he's intimating that if the judges weren't here, I would give you a beating. The mere fact that he has said, because they are, I won't, that negates the assault. I hope that makes sense. It sounds a bit muddled to me. The last thing that I want to cover with you is this notion of apprehension and expectation. Many lecturers get this wrong. It is not about fear. It is about apprehension and expectation. It is only needed that the victim expects, the words of the definition are apprehends, but for that we can use the synonym expects. The victim must apprehend or expect violence to be used, not necessarily fear it, although sometimes that will happen as well. I'll give you an example. My wife is about half my size. If I made her cross and she threatened to slap me across the face, I would certainly apprehend and expect her to use violence against me. I wouldn't fear it because she's much smaller than I, and it wouldn't be something that I would be frightened of. She would still commit the offence because I apprehend and expect it. So I do not need to fear it for the offence to be committed. And the best way to look at that is to look at the two cases of Lamb and Logden. In Lamb, the defendant and the victim were friends. They were playing with a revolver. They were playing Russian roulette. In the chamber were 2 bullets. There's only one here, but there were 2 bullets. Imagine there's another one in here. Neither of the bullets were opposite the chamber. So that meant that the gun was safe as far as the victim was concerned. When the defendant pulled back the hammer on the gun, the revolver rotated, moving the bullet behind the hammer. The defendant points the gun, pulls the trigger, and the gun goes off, killing. The chamber rotates, and the gun goes off, killing the victim. The court says that since the victim shared in the joke and did not feel threatened, so the victim is not threatened, and that's because both of them believed the gun to be safe. There was no expectation of violence because both believed the gun to be safe. There was no assault. And because there's no assault, there's no unlawful act to support the conviction, in this instance, of manslaughter. Not guilty. Now, if you compare that with Logden, what you will see is that in Logden, the defendant showed the victim a replica gun. So the gun there is a replica. And because it's a replica, it cannot cause harm. Well, not by shooting. You could hit her over the head with it, I guess. But the replica gun cannot cause harm as a gun anyway. The gun was in a drawer. And the defendant told the customs officer that he would take her prisoner using the gun unless money owing to him was repaid. The customs officer had reasonable grounds to fear, or to, sorry, that's my fault, to expect that violence would be used or force would be used against her. The nature of the threat, the fact that the defendant had neither the means or the intention to actually use the gun was irrelevant. All that mattered was that the victim was expecting violence, even though the gun could not be used. So in that instance, Logden ends up guilty. Lamb, nobody expects violence, somebody dies, not guilty. Logden, no violence can be used using that gun because it's a replica, but the victim expects it, therefore Logden is guilty. So when you talk about these offences, make sure that you use the words apprehension and expectation and not fear. So that's the first element. The first element being causing the victim to apprehend violence. That's the first element of actus reus. The second element is this concept of immediacy. What do we use by immediacy? And the case that we use here can be used to demonstrate this idea that no words are used. It's just a presence, if you like. Actions can also fulfill the first element of actus reus, but it also helps us to explain the concept of immediacy. And in Smith versus Woking Police Station, the superintendent of Woking Police Station, the defendant is effectively, it's another stalking case, the defendant stands outside the victim's bedroom where he watches her through the window. As he watches her through the window, what happens is that she becomes incredibly frightened. And as she is incredibly frightened, it's made very, very clear that she apprehends some form of violence in the near future. The courts are clear by saying that immediate does not mean instantaneous. The defendant is in the garden. He cannot cause her violence straight away, that very second. But he can cause her violence at some time in the near future. So, because of Smith versus Chief Superintendent Woking Police Station, the concept of immediacy does not mean right this very second. Also consider Ireland and Burstow that we've just discussed. They're making telephone calls. The telephone call, unless they're making it from the same room, is not going to be instantaneous. The telephone box might be some 2 or 3 streets away. And this is going to be a decision for the courts and the juries to decide as to exactly whether or not it was immediate enough. If somebody is passing you on a bus and waves a gun at you, and you know the next bus stop isn't for the next 40 minutes, then that's not going to be sufficient, because you're not going to expect immediate violence. But if you're standing at the bus stop and somebody does it on the bus, then you know that they're going to be getting off in a minute or two, and that probably would fit the Smith versus Chief Superintendent Woking Police Station rule. The third element is this idea of unlawful. And here we have the concept of self-defence. We have the concept of, for instance, a police officer telling somebody that they're going to handcuff them. And that we've got consent as well, and I'll tackle consent in a different video. But the concept of lawfulness means that you have permission to do something. And that's quite obvious when that will be the case. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on that. Just be aware that it is the third element of actus reus. So our three elements of actus reus that we have to prove is that the defendant has to cause the victim to apprehend violence. And that can be by words or silence. That violence has to be expected immediately. And by immediate, we mean sometime in the near future, not necessarily instantaneous. And that it has to be unlawful. There is no lawful reason for the use of the language that would cause that. So those are the three elements of actus reus. The final thing we need to look at is to look at mens rea. An assault is a basic intent crime. Remember, what we mean by a basic intent crime is that it can be committed either by intention or by Cunningham's subjective recklessness. And you can look at the videos again to remind yourself on what we mean by those if you need to. But the case that states that is R versus Savage, and we'll look at Savage in much greater depth when we look at the mens rea for ABH. But in Savage, all that you need to be aware for assault is that Savage states very clearly that the mens rea for assault is the intention or recklessness to cause immediate unlawful harm. All right? If by just saying it's intentional recklessness is not enough. It is the intentional recklessness to cause immediate unlawful harm. So just make sure that you've got that. Savage will state that the intention to cause the apprehension of immediate unlawful personal violence, deliberately, in terms of the intention, if you like, or subjective reckless. And if you can't remember what we mean by subjective reckless, then go back and look at the video, which is the idea that the defendant foresees a risk and goes on to do it anyway. All right, so it's what the defendant foresaw rather than what he should have foreseen. The mens rea for most of these offences are very, very simple. Most of the work that you'll need to do will be work surrounding the actus reus. So I hope that's made assault relatively straightforward. The key things to go over are, in actus reus terms, the victim must be caused to apprehend immediate violence, and that words and silence will be sufficient. It has to be immediate, although that's not instantaneous, and it has to be unlawful. The mens rea is that the defendant must intend or be reckless as to causing immediate unlawful harm. I'll see you next time in the video on battery.